This week, Dan Benjamin from Dig Security is with us to discuss data security in the cloud. Then Patty Harrington from Forrester joins us to talk about IoT security. Finally, in the enterprise security news, cyber insurance is doing better, but still a mess. 3 new cybersecurity startups, 7 new fundings, including a $100 million Series B for Cyera, 2 acquisitions, 2 hot takes, 24 companies destroyed by a breach. IronNet drama intensifies. Is the SEC taking the wheel? Valence's 2023 State of SaaS report. That's where I work. And a camera without a lens. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
The cybersecurity landscape is full of single solution providers, making it easy for unexpected cyber threats to sneak through the cracks. That's why Forrester is creating a stronger, simpler strategy for protection, one that increases your security maturity while decreasing the operational burden that comes with it. This is all possible thanks to Forrester's best-in-class portfolio and deep bench of expert problem solvers. Forrester's integrated, scalable solutions help customers face their toughest challenges with confidence. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Fortra, Fortra. Do the words free time or relaxation sound foreign to you? Perhaps you've been stuck in the office too long, battling cyber threats or worrying about the next strain of ransomware. Let Sophos help provide peace of mind 24/7, 365 with cybersecurity delivered as a service. Because we want you to get back to your weekends, family dinners, and everything in between. And you'll get there with Sophos. Visit securityweekly.com/Sophos to learn more. When organizations face poor web performance, challenges building modern applications at scale, or need to reduce operational and development costs, they turn to Fastly. Fastly's distributed edge network means your business can unleash its growth potential without worrying about scaling your infrastructure, whether for growth of users, transaction volume, or geographic expansion. Get the speed, security, and edge cloud innovation you need to deliver profitable and engaging experiences. Visit securityweekly.com/Fastly for more information or to speak to an expert. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy National Handshake Day. This is episode 322, recorded on Thursday, June 29th, 2023. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me is the Czar of Zero Trust, the captain of content, the reformed analyst, Katie Teitler. How are you, Katie?
I'm well, but I do wish the handshake would die. It's kind of gross. It's always been kind of gross. There are other better ways to say hello to people and greet people and be excited to see them without shaking hands.
Yeah, it's deeply ingrained in a lot of cultures, but that was actually something I was going to bring up after going to RSA this year. I'd say probably 10 to 20% of the handshake opportunities were dead. Like people were just not willing to handshake anymore. There were elbow bumps, there were fist bumps. So yeah, I think you might get your wish, Katie. I think it's getting to that point.
I really thought that COVID would finally do away with the handshake. And if I know you well and I'm comfortable with you, hey, I'll give you a hug if it's the appropriate situation. But I think handshakes in particular, and when you go to conferences, when you go to other public places where you're touching things that a lot of other people that you don't know and who might not have a certain sense of hygiene I think it's important. And sorry to go off on a hygiene issue, but I'm also all about security hygiene, so it ties in there, right?
Yeah, there's some guys out there where it's just like a test your strength type of thing. Like you go in for the handshake and you're like, oh, okay, it's going to be one of these, huh? Like
I've always hated that.
I got to squeeze really hard, huh?
Always hated that.
And that is the Baron of Bloodhound, the Pirate King of PowerShell, Sean Metcalf. How you doing, Sean?
Hey, Adrian, doing good. Coming off of a week off of ESW and time with family, which is always nice. But yeah, about the handshake. Yeah, I'm with Katie on this. I think that the handshake has always been kind of an awkward thing, and eh, a lot of times you social convention says you shake hands. I think it's National Handshake Day, but I also think it's National Adrian Let the Hair Out Day. So. Looking
His
good.
flowing locks.
I did wash my hair not too long ago, so yeah, it's actually still drying. I don't put it up when it's still drying, so you get to enjoy it being down.
It looks great.
One last thing on handshakes. I remember the first time I traveled to the Middle East. I'm not paranoid, but I do a lot of research before I do something like that. And the reason we were going meant I had to do even more research. So in the culture, like I knew handshakes were an integral thing, and that and to expect the handshake to last a very long time, like possibly the length of an entire conversation. So you could be holding that handshake for 5 minutes, 15 minutes.
Oh,
And that's exactly what happened. My first handshake when I met our point of contact over in Bahrain, when I was over there to do to do a full red team for an organization. That was the longest handshake of my life. It was
Wow, that's impressive.
Like, face to face, looking into somebody's eyes, holding their hand for 15 minutes. It's intense. And
it's
you
a
have to
close handshake, right? You're right in their
handshake.
space. It's like, hi, let's have a conversation from about a foot apart. I've definitely been in conversations like that. And I think a lot of it's cultural. I mean, Katie mentions hygiene, security. Certainly there's different boundaries of spacing based on culture as well. Not just, do you shake hands or not, but also how close are you to the person when you're talking? So I imagine you were pretty close as you're engaged and locked in hand-to-hand grip as you're having a close conversation, right?
And it's apparently rude to try and pull your hand away. So you have to resist that urge the entire time. And after a while, it's just like, yeah, whatever, those impulses pass after like the first 30 seconds or so. But yeah, it was funny because some of the stuff I researched, just absolute BS, like didn't find it at all. And then the other half. So I had no idea. It was rolling the dice every time. I was very careful about everything I did. I didn't want to insult anybody. But yeah, the handshake is real in the Middle East.
Biggest myths?
Oh, like showing the bottom, like crossing your legs, showing the bottom of your foot. And it could be that in different parts of the Middle East, it's different. We do have, I haven't introduced Dan Benjamin yet, but we do have somebody who probably knows some of these better than I do. But yeah, thumbs up was another one. It was like thumbs up is an offensive gesture. And I get to Bahrain and rent a car, and we're driving to the hotel, and they have these lotteries over there, and there's billboards everywhere, with a guy holding like a wad of cash and like giving a thumbs up with the other hand. I'm like, okay, so clearly some of what I researched is not correct. The internet,
or maybe thumbs up means you have money.
Yeah, I don't know. It looked very much like a Western, like, hey, I'm having a good time. This is a good deal. You should do it. Thumbs up. But all right, let's move on from handshakes. Quick announcement here. You can now find us on Instagram. Follow us for highlight reels, giveaway announcements, and more at Sec Weekly. And I believe we're Sec Weekly on Twitter as well. So usually we're either Security Weekly or Sec Weekly. Yeah, there it is. If you're looking at this, we have a few visual cues going on for folks listening to the audio only version of this. All right. For our first interview, today's topic is data security in the cloud. We're excited to have Dan Benjamin with us today. Dan is the co-founder and CEO at Dig Security. He's an entrepreneur with over a decade of industry experience, has held leadership roles at Microsoft and Google, which is where he spotted a gap in public cloud data security solutions, which led him to co-found Dig. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and before I apologize for all the puns, but before we dig in, I'd love to hear your insight on handshakes in the Middle East.
First off, I'm a hugger. I mean, in Israel, we hug. So
Oh,
whenever
yeah.
we meet someone
too.
new and we like them, they get a hug. I'm not a big fan of the handshakes, especially not long handshakes. That's a little bit claustrophobic for me, but new people get a hug from me. So I'm a hugger.
Yeah, and that's something I had to learn also, is that not everybody's a hugger. So I've had a few awkward hugs where I realized I imposed a hug on someone who really did not, want to have full body contact with me.
I just did that at a recent someone that from my past that I saw that I've been out with socially, just the two of us, hadn't seen in a couple of years, and this person came up and I gave this person a great big enthusiastic hug, and at the end of the conversation, as they were leaving, they reached out to give me a handshake, and I thought, oh, whoops.
Yeah, I've had a few of those awkward moments. So Dan, let's God, I promise I'm not gonna do too many dig puns. It's very
Oh, you
difficult.
have to use the actual dig puns. Let's dig in. I dig security. I mean, we use them all the time.
I can dig it.
Oh boy. All right. Let's go. So in the intro, I mentioned your background at Microsoft, and what was it that you were seeing that kind of inspired you to, or made you notice the gap here, and inspired you to found a company that focuses on this space?
Of course. So at Microsoft, I initially led SaaS security. So I led the actual Microsoft CASB, MCAS, or now Microsoft Defender for Cloud Applications. And after that, switched over to essentially lead the multi-cloud security strategy at Microsoft. So how does Microsoft become AWS security and GCP security? And as we were crafting what does multi-cloud security even mean, I started interviewing a lot of customers. I think I interviewed approximately 50 of the Fortune 500 in a period of a couple of months. And every single one of those customers kept repeating the same exact questions around data. What data do I even own across my clouds? We started migrating across AWS and Azure and GCP and Snowflake, and we have kind of all of this information that we ported from the on-prem into the cloud, and we just don't understand what do we have in our clouds. Second, how is that data being used? Which applications, users, vendors, contractors are touching which pieces of information? And lastly, how do I protect this information? I used to have DLP controls in the on-prem. I used to have DLP controls in the endpoints. I basically have nothing in the cloud. And as we all see today, 50% of data breaches are happening in the cloud. We're going to see more and more because more data is being migrated into the cloud. We're at this tipping point that there's now more data in public clouds versus on-prem. And we just have zero controls. And I didn't see any good solution that was essentially built either at Microsoft or at AWS or at Google Cloud. And I didn't see anything that spanned across multiple clouds. So I decided to build it myself. And I partnered up with two of my good friends, Ido and Gad, and we built a company. We wanted to essentially dig into this problem space. I had to use the pun as well. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, we're not going to put any restrictions on puns. I've decided for this episode. It's just
On this show, you can't.
It's just too hard. It's too hard. But yeah. So back when I was an industry analyst at 451 Research, I predicted that data security would be one of the last problems that we would tackle. Just because it's so difficult to put controls around data, to classify data. It just seemed like a really hard problem, and I predicted we were going to tackle all the the lower hanging fruit first. And I feel like we're pretty much at that point where there's at least, maybe it's not the best solution, but just about everywhere else in security, there is a market. Any kind of asset. Any space where security is needed, there's some product out there. We've got over 4,000 vendors, enterprise B2B security vendors these days. And so do you feel like this was something where the technology had to get to a certain point for us to be able to tackle this first, or was it more that founders just and it's not like we didn't have DLP, but classic DLP, people don't have fond thoughts of their previous DLP solutions. So why now, I guess, is the question. Has technology gotten us to a point to where we can do this better than we could 10 years ago? Or is it basically the same challenges, and with the benefit of hindsight, we can come at it better?
Wow, that's a big question, and I think there's multiple answers here. But I would start with kind of a couple of different factors. So first off, I think the pain has just gotten bigger, right? On-prem, we used to use 3, 4, 5, 6 different types of data stores. A typical enterprise today running in a public cloud has 30 or 40 different types of data stores on thousands, if not tens of thousands of instances. So everything just got multiplied when we started getting into the cloud, when we started moving into microservices, when we started having multiple deployment models, right? We used to have only IaaS data stores. Now you have PaaS services, and you have databases as a service like Snowflake and Atlas and Databricks. So first off, the problem just got intensified. The fragmentation got so much higher. Second, of course, we have tons of data regulations. So we initially started with kind of Sarbanes-Oxley and PCI and HIPAA, but now we, of course, have GDPR in Europe that essentially catapulted kind of privacy regulations around data all over the globe. So we have CCPA in California today, and we're talking kind of about a federal law in the US. We have LGPD in Brazil. We have the Indian data law that is now coming in. So multiple privacy laws and the FTC safeguards. So a lot of controls that are mandated by the governments to essentially control data and put better protections. And lastly, the actual technology made it easier. I don't know if you've ever used kind of an older data security product. I would call these Gen 1. I don't know if you ever use like a Varonis or a Big ID or those kind of older products. But those products mandated you to essentially manually connect thousands of data stores into a product. And that made those types of data security projects cumbersome. They made them long. You had to put multiple FTEs to just maintain a specific security product.
A lot of overhead.
I think that the technology, tons. And today in the public clouds, you can essentially span and classify and categorize and visualize all your data in less than 24 hours. You essentially plug into the cloud, and with the ability to essentially create snapshots and backups and exports and essentially do this kind of analysis of data stores automatically instead of manually connecting data stores, it's phenomenal. Organizations today that have kind of switched from Gen 1 to Gen 2 are seeing value in less than a day. This is unheard of in data security up until 2 years ago. So I'm super excited about the actual category. I think it was underserved for many, many, many years. And now we can essentially bring it home. And we can build bigger and faster and actually allow organizations to better control data.
Yeah, Kate, I think Katie had a question.
Yeah, as you just mentioned, a lot of this didn't become possible until about 2 years ago. But also, about 2 years ago, every new company, every entrepreneur and their brother, sister, cousin, grandmother decided that DSPM is a super hot space and they want to go into it. What challenges does that create for you as an entrepreneur, founder, product developer, marketer? You're doing it all right now since you're a startup. So what are the challenges there for you in this space that a lot of people are jumping into?
I actually think it's fantastic, to be honest. We're building a new category. And I always say that you need between 8 to 10 competitors to build a good category. We're all essentially educating the market and, well, this is a big thing. This is something that we need to put focus on. We're all marketing the same thing. And we're all trying to help organizations better protect their information. So first off, market awareness came to this market super quickly. When we started the company, it was the end of 2021. most organizations didn't put data security as top 3 priority. Talk to most organizations today, data security is top 1 priority. You see kind of the Gartner reports. Gartner reports say that 20% of all enterprises are going to have a DSPM technology by end of 2025. This category was born 9 months ago. I mean, officially born 9 months ago. So kind of moving from no category at all to all enterprises are going to have DSPM, or 20% of enterprises are going to have DSPM by the end of 2025. It's phenomenal. And this is just because we have multiple vendors in the category. But then it's, of course, a game of execution. Who can bring this product to market in a better fashion? Who can build a good culture and a good technology that essentially solve this problem better than others? So I think it's better to operate in a category that has multiple competitors versus operating in a category that doesn't. So I'm grateful to have my peers try to solve this problem as well.
It's true. You don't want to be in a category by yourself, because then there's always the fear, does nobody want this? Can nobody use
not
this?
A category. Yeah, and it's interesting, not to throw shade or anything, but one of those categories that I'm very skeptical about is the enterprise browser market. And to your to your point about what Gartner is predicting here, Dan, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a company that doesn't have this problem. So this was very much a market that was the only reason they weren't searching or buying something is just because it wasn't there. So the moment you started filling that vacuum, absolutely I can see the interest in it. But yeah, definitely. So we've had some other folks, some other founders from other DSPMs on, and it's interesting to see how they view the market, because some are not exclusively cloud focused. Some are building their products for on-prem, for cloud. There are different approaches to it. Obviously, data's just such a generic thing. There are many different ways that you can approach it. There's some things that everybody has to do, though, right? Like you have to find the data, and you have to figure out what that data is. Again, you mentioned all the legislation going on. Some data applies to some of that legislation. Some, whether you're talking PCIe, I forget the Brazilian one that's like
LGBT.
LGBT. Like you've got to classify all that data, and then you've got to I don't know. Back when I was a PCI QSA, the difficult thing that we always had to do is figure out the data flow diagram, right? Like we had to identify the data and figure out how it got from point A to point Z. And I wonder if any of these products are doing that, or how you approach this so it's consumable by your customers, where it's not overwhelming. You're talking about the overhead with things like Varonis and some of the more traditional legacy data protection products out there.
Yeah, so I think ease of use is probably the most important thing today in cybersecurity. I think if you don't build products that your consumers like to consume on a daily basis or a weekly basis, depending on the product itself, you're not going to do well in the markets. So first off, understanding that you need to build something that is easy is super important. So our product essentially looks at this as phases. You got it exactly right. First off, we have to essentially discover any type of data store that lives in the customer's environment. So it can be past data stores, anything that essentially is managed by the cloud, like an RDS and an Azure SQL and a Google BigQuery. And that is something that you essentially discover through APIs, but you also have VMs running a data store. How do you find that a developer booted up a MySQL running on Linux? Or how do you find that a developer booted up an MS SQL running on Windows? So you also need to find those, and we have a really cool technology that allows us to discover all of these different types of data stores automatically. Once we discover them, we need to, of course, classify the information. And then you also have a little split, right? Because you have unstructured data, which is files in buckets and file shares. You have structured data, and it can be anything like relational databases. And you have semi-structured data storage, like DynamoDB and MongoDB and Cosmos. And there we essentially have a really cool technology that allows us to, of course, take either a backup, an export, or a snapshot, analyze the information on a replica of the actual data store itself. So without actually adding load into the actual customer's database. So we discover, we classify the data itself, but then you need to bring in context on top of the data. So first off, of course, where do we have PII or PHI or PCIe or any type of regulated data? Where do we have sensitive data just to us as an organization? We need to understand and bring in this business context, this organizational context into the data. How is data flowing inside the organization? Who has access to it? Am I compliant both with my business regulations, but also with my privacy regulations? Where do I have data exposure or data risk? And lastly, our goal is to also protect the data. So Dig is very unique in that aspect of it in our market. We coined the term data detection response, which essentially says we're still going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of people, machines, vendors, contractors. All of those are going to have access to this information. So even if we have fantastic posture, we're still going to need to essentially protect data by those that essentially have access to it. So I might have an encrypted S3 bucket with tons of sensitive information, but it's encrypted and I think I'm safe. But then you'll have a machine that get compromised and someone will do a mass download or copy all the information out to a different cloud or copy the information to an FTP or do a mass encryption like ransomware. So we always need to also look in real time what's actually happening with this information. And that's where data detection response comes in. Gartner is now also including it into this category as well. And the goal here is to implement DLP-like controls into the public cloud and to be able to identify what should never happen with data and also how do we detect and how do we respond to these types of events. So essentially combining both the data security posture management side of it, discovery, classification, risk analysis, but also the real-time aspects of it. Very similar to what happened in kind of CSPM and workload protection that eventually merged into Synapse.
So, a few questions about, so AWS does have a product, that can do some data classification. They've got Macy. Is this something that you leverage, or, how do you handle that question when you're talking to prospects and they're asking, why wouldn't we just use this? I mean, I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but would like to hear your take on that, how you handle those questions.
Of course. So first off, Macy is only for unstructured data. So it only handles buckets. You need to manually trigger it, and it will scan specific buckets for sensitive information.
So it's
Macy,
S3?
Yeah, just S3. Now, most environments today, even if they run in a single cloud, will have 20 different types of data stores. So right. Covering 1/20th of your data is not a good thing. Also, most customers are running multi-cloud. So then you need to double or triple the variety of data assets that you also need to scan and analyze. Now, you don't want to run Macy in one cloud and Google Cloud VPN, Google Cloud, and Purview just on Azure. You essentially want a system that will span across any type of cloud that you essentially have and across any type of data store that you have. And lastly, you want it to be efficient and affordable. I always say that classification is a combination of kind of three main important factors. First off, price. If it's too expensive, you're not going to run it. Second, of course, is speed. How long will it take you to essentially classify the information? How quickly can you distribute this across the organization? And lastly, of course, is accuracy. Because if the results are not good, then you're not going to use the product. And I think AWS Macy kind of lacked in all of those aspects of it. Speed is actually not bad, but the accuracy and cost is just too expensive for most organizations. And then, of course, coverage.
And I imagine, so all the DSPMs we've talked to, because this data is sensitive, it would get very complicated if you pulled this back into, your cloud enclaves to do the classification. So I assume you're doing that classification within the customer's area. So there's something that they have to deploy, containers or EC2 instances, something like that to run that classifier engine. Is that correct?
Correct. We essentially do all the data analysis in the customer's environments. So we don't copy any data out. We don't feed the customer's information, of course. And there's also kind of another factor there that you actually need to do the data analysis and data classification in the customer's region. So whenever you do that data analysis, if let's say they're a multinational brand, and we have many of those using the Dig Security platform, then let's say they're operating right now in 15 regions. Every time you classify information of a specific region, you need to classify that in that specific region. Otherwise, you're breaking data residency.
Right.
So there's multiple challenges in data classification in customers' environments. But I think Dig cracked it quite well. Basically, our implementation takes a couple minutes. You just deploy a couple of roles, and Dig will do that orchestration for the data classification for the customer. So the customer doesn't need to actually deploy a container or deploy VMs. That's very hard for organizations typically to manage. So all they need to do is deploy a couple of roles, and Dig will do that data classification orchestration in the customer's environment automatically.
So trying to think about the process the customer will go through when using your product. Your product draws attention to something that looks potentially bad. We're talking about the data detection and response process here. Certainly for incident response, for asset management especially, and part of this is like asset management, discovering your data and understanding how that data is used and who's using it. Can you make it easier for somebody to figure out who the asset owner is for the data? Say like the thing you're looking at that looks suspicious, it's just an application owner or a service account, or you just see Kubernetes doing something that it doesn't look like that account should be doing or doesn't normally do. Like how do you make that process easier for the customer?
Excellent question. So first off, we kind of split this into two components. So in DSPM, there's a component called data access governance. Who has access to what data stores and to what pieces of information? And that's kind of who can do something, right? Who can read something and who can write something. But because Dig also looks at real-time activity of the actual data stores, and that's kind of the data detection response component, then we also have who is using that information. And we put these two layers on top of each other. And that gives us really interesting insights. So first off, not only we know who has access, but we also know who can access which pieces of information across any type of data store that is deployed in the customer's cloud. Now, data ownership is a difficult challenge, right? There is no magic here. I always used to say that in the Army, we used to have something called the scream test. I was in the 8200 unit 20 years ago. And whenever we had a server and we didn't know who owned it, we just unplugged it from the electricity and saw who screamed, right? So that was the scream test in the Army. In the cloud, you can't really do something like that. But you can see which identities, which machines, which applications are using.
Sure, you can. You can do that in the cloud. It's just not going to end well.
Exactly, or you're going to get fired. So in the cloud, we can see who's actually touching this piece of information, which applications, users, and vendors. So at least you have the first hop of who to go to versus kind of just drawing a blank and seeing, okay, I have this data store, now who do I ask? So sometimes we can derive context from the business units if they have the right tags. And sometimes we can derive the context from who created the type of data store, who's interacting with the type of data store, or from the pieces of information that live inside. But there is no magic for data ownership. It's a big challenge. And lastly, sometimes organizations already have a data catalog inside the organization. They implemented Equilibra or Annihilation in the past, and we can pull that context from there. Now, in terms of verifying the identity itself, then of course we plug into the Cloud IAM so we can understand the different identities. And if there's federation, we also plug into the customer's IDP. So whether it is Active Directory and Okta and Ping, and we can pull in additional information so we can enrich the identity that is now doing the actions.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, Sean, I think you had a question.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry. I was just processing what you said, Ben. It makes a lot of sense, and it ties into my next question, or my question here, certainly about data ownership and how it's managed. One challenge that's been around for years is ensuring that the correct people has rights to the specific data files that they should have access to, but not anyone else. I've seen file shares open to everyone or large groups of people to ensure this access is provided. And tightening down this is challenging. This happens also in SharePoint Online. It happens also in across data stores. As you said, now there's 30 to 40 of them. There are a few approaches to this, like Microsoft's Azure Information Protection, which has classification and encryption. But what do you see as the best approach to handle this data management problem?
That's a big question. Now, right-sizing data access is a massive challenge. I think that first off, the easiest approach is eliminating access that is not being used. That's number one. And I've seen that deployed in many of the organizations that I used to work with. And it's not only cloud, it's also an approach that we've been taking for the past 20 years. That's actually my first startup, by the way. My first startup did identity and access management and entitlements management. We sold that company to CA back in 2014. And it's very close to data, right? Data and identity go together. You can't access data unless you're authenticated today. So first off, remove access that is not being used. Second, I think managers have the best context today inside the organization and the employee itself. So I believe that the future is going to go closer to what SailPoint used to do, which is kind of permission certification, which essentially says that employees will have to essentially explain why do they have specific access to that is very permissive, and then potentially their manager will need to reapprove that as well. I think that's the easiest approaches. So first off, eliminate access that is not being used, and highlight that because you can already understand the usage itself. Highlight to the employee that that he or she have access that is highly permissive, and then ask them, do you really need this? And lastly, of course, involve the managers and highlight the risks there. I think this gradual approach will be able to essentially minimize a lot of permissions to extremely sensitive information. And of course, combining that with compliance and regulation. Back in the day, in my first company, we essentially had to help organizations handle suburban-Auxley. And then you had to kind of make sure that a teller in the bank cannot issue a loan, but also approves the loan, right? It's the same story here. You want to make sure that no one has access that they shouldn't have, and no one has toxic access as well.
Right.
I think that makes sense. So a follow-up question there. When you're talking about basically putting the onus on the user to say, I need this access, or this is why I need this access, and it goes to the data owner. That makes a lot of sense. It's very similar to what I've seen in the identity access and management security realm, especially around Active Directory and Azure AD, where users, the things that have worked well is have a system where basically someone has to request it and then re-request that access, basically revalidate the access to having privileged rights. So extending this to the data protection and security or data posture management side of things makes a lot of sense. When you're talking about this, certainly my thinking goes immediately to, okay, how do you ensure that the data is classified appropriately in order for the user to know what they're applying for, and then certainly to ensure that the data that is classified a certain way gets managed or owned by the right folks? Because certainly you talked about unstructured data, structured data, and being across multiple data stores. It could be on-prem, it could be in Azure, it could be in AWS, it could be in GCP, multiple cloud providers. As you said, there's lots of different places where these can be. How do you pull all this together, and maybe what's the solution that you've taken, or the approach you've taken with Dig?
first off, I think this is why this challenge is so exciting, right? It's complicated. It's really complicated, and we're solving a really big problem for a lot of the organizations. Now, data classification is challenging. I think it became easier with technology. I think we learned from our past mistakes, right? In the past, data classification used to be regex-based. Regex-based does not really work in today's age. Everything looks the same. You don't want to take any combination of digits and say this is a credit card or a phone number. It doesn't really work. So first off, you need to have a very, very good data classification engine. In at Dig, we took the approach of a 4-tiered classification engine. So first off, of course, you need to be able to match a specific pattern. That's the same that we used to have in the past. Then, of course, you want to derive context. And deriving context is super important for this specific stage. So you always want to think about it as a funnel. How do we make sure that we have the right results? So context essentially can be brought in from multiple locations. If it's a file, you want to take the file name, you want to take the preceding words and the words after. You want to take the column name in the CSV if it's a CSV file. You want to take the key value if it's a JSON. You want to take the key value if it's an XML. So deriving context is super important from wherever you can, also in structured data. So we're taking the column name and the table name and understanding kind of everything that you can to essentially amplify or de-amplify the actual results. Third, you need to validate the actual results. So I think most modern data classification engines are now using validator functions. And validator functions can essentially validate that the result is actually correct. For credit cards, you have something called Lund's algorithm that essentially validates the checksum of the actual cards. And you can validate these structures with real functions that essentially validate the actual results. And lastly, we have models today. So whenever you have a noisy classifier, you can always incorporate a model to kind of fine-tune the actual results. And I think this 4-tiered approach is what the leading data classification engines today are doing, and it's the same approach that we essentially took as well. So first off, you need to have a really, really, really strong foundation for the actual data classification. You want to have the same classification across any type of data store and every type of cloud that you use, because otherwise, if you use different engines, it just becomes really, really complicated.
Inconsistency, yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's why, for example, the fact that Macy will only work on AWS and Purview will only work on Azure and Google Cloud DLP will only work on Google Cloud is just making it even harder, right? I actually think that the Google Cloud DLP engine is pretty good. It's just limited, right? Limited to specific types of data stores and specific clouds. And then once you have this good foundation of understanding which data you have, then you just need to apply it and use the same paradigm that we were talking about earlier. If the classification is correct, then users should be able to understand that they're accessing now credit card information or they're accessing restricted data. And then what surprised me, I think, in my last startup is that users, if you guide them correctly, will be your best help in cybersecurity. I think 90% is education, 10% is execution. So if you educate the users correctly and you prompt them correctly and you guide them throughout, how do you help security make a better job? I think they'll help you always. You just need to make it easy for them, because if it's hard, no one will do it.
Right. Very true. So we're running short on time, but we do have a few audience questions that I wanted to get into, and I'm going to try and combine two questions here. And I think you partially answered one of them about how you classify the data. So there's a question around, are those models customized to the customer, or are they kind of generic across customers for different data types? And then the other question is more about, we talked a little bit about horizontal scaling. If somebody's got 15 different regions, they've got data residency concerns, but what if somebody's got like petabytes of data within like a single region? How do you scale vertically, and how much of a challenge is that when you get a customer that just has massive amounts of data, either in databases or just unstructured data sitting on S3 or Glacier or something like that?
Great questions. So first off, regarding classification, we essentially support today, I think, almost 150 different classifiers that we come with out of the box, but we also allow customers to build their own classifiers through the platform. And we've seen customers build that for membership cards and loyalty cards and gamer ID, because we work with a very large gaming company. We've seen that for specific routing numbers that are super sensitive to them. So most of our customers typically build a couple of classifiers that are specifically relevant for their businesses, but we come with our own and we constantly add additional ones. So that's regarding classification. Now, you mentioned earlier about scaling. So today we analyzed, I think, approximately 200 petabytes across our customer environments. And you mentioned vertically, but we actually scale horizontally. So how we typically work is that we analyze information using a set of spun up VMs that essentially do a classification job in a customer environment. So typically we spin up a VM to do a classification job. And once that classification job is dead, that VM essentially dies. Very typical to how Lambda works, but we need disk activity. So Lambdas are not the best thing. And that's basically how we scale. So each customer can define what's the maximum number of VMs that they allow the DSPM security platform to run in their environment. And that's to essentially control cost. But from there, we have basically infinite scale. So customers can say, my environment is super large and I want to classify everything. And they will be able to run 20 VMs in parallel. And each one will essentially take a subset of the job. Or I want to limit the cost and make sure that only a maximum of 5 VMs can essentially run. And then, of course, we'll be able to cover a little bit less ground, but we'll cover everything just a little bit slower. So the ability to essentially control cost is through the maximum number of VMs, but the ability to scale is through that maximum number of VMs that we can essentially spin up to do scanning in that bucket or that database or that analytics data store.
Yeah. I think I was misusing the vertical and horizontal terms. I was kind of thinking in terms of number of regions and things like that. But yeah, absolutely makes sense that you can scale horizontally with the classification jobs. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I wish I could ask more questions around, kind of the customer process, the detection and response, and the kind of things that you see. We'll just have to have you come back and so we can fire some more questions at you, because I'm super interested. Yeah, once people get everything classified and they're comfortable using the product, I think there's a lot of interesting questions there around what that workflow looks like. What kind of insights and detections you can pull out of that. I imagine there's a whole niche of detection engineering just in a data security product like this.
Definitely. And we have a large data security research team. They actually presented today at B-Sites Tel Aviv. I was very proud. We found a very interesting vulnerability in Google Cloud, in their Cloud SQL, which is their managed SQL database. So tons of detection engineering goes into the product. Super interesting work and a really good team. But I'd love to come and chat about it again.
Yeah, now that we've covered the fundamentals, we can launch just straight into that next time.
Definitely.
All right, Dan, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today. This has been a really great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate the time.
All right, stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk IoT security with Patty Harrington from Forrester Research.